Welcome to Heart Challenges Hate, a discussion series, sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the Department of Catholic Studies, and the Center for Catholic Studies. Today we discuss anti-Semitism, the enduring hatred. Join us now live from the campus of Sacred Heart University with your host, Dr. Michelle Loris.
My name is Michelle Loris, and I will be our moderator for tonight's Heart Challenges Hate conversation on anti-Semitism, the enduring hatred. We're sponsored by the College of Arts and Science, the Department of Catholic Studies, and the Center for Catholic Studies. The purpose of the Heart Challenges Hate series is to respond to the prevalence of hatred, violence, and bigotry that we see in America today with knowledge and reasoned discussion, faith, and values. It's our assumption at Sacred Heart University that it's our responsibility and that we have a role to play in speaking against this injustice and violence that plagues America today. Tonight, we talk about anti-Semitism, which is a prejudice against Jews as individuals and as a group. And this is a prejudice which began in ancient Greece and Rome, which showed its most horrifying example in the Holocaust, and its most recent example in the Tree of Life synagogue killing that occurred almost 2 years ago. Tonight, we want to discuss why are the Jewish people so hated? What can we do to counter this ongoing prejudice and discrimination? What's a little bit about the history of this discrimination and hatred? Tonight, to help us think about these questions, I'm delighted to introduce our panel. Dr. Hadar Lubin, co-director of the Post-Traumatic Stress Center in New Haven and assistant clinical professor at Yale University. Mr. Gary Jones, executive director of the Jewish Federation of Western Connecticut, and Rabbi Marcello Cormis, rabbi at the Congregation Bethel in Fairfield and campus minister at Sacred Heart University. Welcome all of you, and thank you for being here tonight to have this discussion. So let's get started. My first question for all of you is, how do we define the fullness of anti-Semitism? How do we help our audience out there really understand what anti-Semitism means? What's its definition? What does it look like in our society? I don't know who wants to jump in on that one.
Could go first. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Michelle, and thank you to Sacred Heart University for hosting this colloquium about anti-Semitism. It's very meaningful that a Catholic university is hosting a colloquium about anti-Semitism. It speaks volume about the mission of Sacred Heart University. So I would like to thank you, Michelle, and the university for this invitation. When we define anti-Semitism, there are a number of ways how we could do it. We could use some technical definitions, like the definition that the ADL, for example, uses. I brought it here. It says, anti-Semitism is the belief or behavior hostile toward Jews just because they are Jewish, right? And continues, with the idea that it may take the form of religious teachings that proclaim the inferiority of Jews, for instance, or political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudice or stereotyped views about Jews, right? So we could use that technical definition, but I think that anti-Semitism goes way beyond that. And to me, anti-Semitism is the longest hatred in our Western society. And unfortunately, there is a ready market for anti-Semitism in our modern world. And it has been taking different ways, it has been taking different aspects. If it is to marginalize or to criticize or to put aside the Jewish people or attack the state of Israel and attack the Jews as a collective group. So I believe there are many ways how we can define what anti-Semitism is. As a rabbi, it's very painful to me to see that we, the Jewish people, have been discriminated for almost as long as the Western
Thousands
society,
of years.
right? For
Thousands
so
of
many
years.
years.
Yeah.
So I think that when we get so technical, we lose sight of what are the implications of anti-Semitism in our modern society.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I
Gary.
would just like to add, first of all, to the rabbis, thanks for having this this program on anti-Semitism, but also the fact that you're addressing so many of the hatreds that face our country and working to help the world understand what's happening and what we can do to make life better for everybody. And that's one of the things that's very important to the Jewish people. We believe we're here to help repair the world, to make it a better place. And we know that while we're here focusing principally on issues that affect Jews particularly, our job in life is also to work to support other people, to stand up for others who are being put upon or being treated unfairly. So thank you for all you're doing.
You're quite welcome. And the
respect.
Jewish people have a remarkable history of that, of being at the forefront of fighting for justice in so many arenas.
Thank you.
And often for then being discriminated against for doing that,
Yes.
if you will. In America, that's one of the actually instances of
Correct.
prejudice against Jewish people.
The Tree of Life murderer actually stated that one of the reasons he did it is because Jews are supporting immigrants.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's 100% right.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah. There is a sage named Hillel who has a sort of a way to help, I think, us understand our obligations in the world. And the first of his three-pronged test is, if we are not for ourselves, who will be for us? The second, if we're only for ourselves, then what are we? And finally, if not now, when? So that sort of does help, I think, to formulate the basis for which Jews try to be involved in all aspects of justice and supporting victims wherever they may be. The one thing that I would add to, I thought what the rabbi did was brilliant in terms of explaining anti-Semitism, but it is something that morphs over time. It lasts so and is so strong over millennia is because it changes to adapt to different circumstances. So to put it very briefly, historically, when there is a problem in a society or a perceived problem in a society, and that society was looking for a scapegoat, often the Jews would be the convenient scapegoat for the problems. Historically, in the Middle East, when there was plague, bubonic plague, Jews were blamed. And that kind of mechanism has continued throughout much of Jewish history, unfortunately. And it starts with the fact that Jews have traditionally been the minority, but also sometimes the only minority in many of the civilizations in Europe and elsewhere. So when you had a problem, there weren't many options.
Right.
The Jews were there and the Jews were convenient.
Yeah.
Hadar, did you want to?
Yeah, I would like to add something, but not before as well. I'll thank you to inviting me, us, and most importantly, to have this conversation in a form of open conversation, of thinking about it aloud, because actually the first step, if we'll get to the outcome of such kind of conversation, the first step in really tackling this kind of blind hatred is to have an open conversation and understanding really what people are thinking, and that's a place where kind change can take place, because hatred is blind and it doesn't really lead to much of resolution. But I wanted to kind of, Gary, when you spoke about the transformation or the ability of anti-Semitism to morph over the millennial and also to change form, I think it's kind of give us a little bit of an insight how it really survived for so many years. It started, as you actually mentioned it started in Roman time, and around the Crusaders. The main objection to the Jews was anti-Judaic. The Jews did not want to take on the gods, and they maintained the monolithic view and their tradition.
They just want to be faithful in their
in their own
belief.
way of practicing. Exactly. So the first attempt of explaining the hatred toward Jews was actually an anti-Judaic perspective, which kind of morphed and changed around the Reformation, where it became an anti-Semitic. It kind of pinpoint that actually you are to hate a Jew. It's not only how they practice, but just the fact, as you said before, just because they're a Jew, they should be hated. And that kind of took many forms over the years. And I would like to bring it to most contemporary time, where from anti-Judaic to anti-Semitism to the most contemporary version of anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli kind of rhetoric, where the Israel became the Jewish state is the Jew among nations. So the ability to adapt, if you will, hatred really followed all different ways the Jews tried to live their life in the way they chose to live and in their ancestral land where they are.
Right. And you see also over the long arc of history, certain myths and stereotypes being developed about the Jewish people. So, you mentioned the Reformation, and certainly that was when Martin Luther came out with his pamphlet, The Jews and Their Lies, right? And but the kinds of, for example, during that time, the Jews could not own land. They were not part of the regular civic community. They couldn't participate in the guilds or the professions. And so they were forced, actually, by the powers that be, to become money lenders. That was forced on them. And yet, that's one of the stereotypes that plagues the Jewish people to the 21st century, I think. Not that there is a predominant attitude about that, but it certainly has. We could certainly see it in the 20th century in America. Some of the diatribe that Henry Ford wrote, when he wrote, what did he write? Over 90 conspiracy theories about the Jews, right? To a population of over 700,000 people. But some of those theories had to do with that stereotype, for example. Then, certainly, there's no question that in the earlier times, the Middle Ages, the Reformation, and even after that, there's the stereotype of the Jewish person as consorting with the devil, if you will. And that stereotype comes up again in World War, right around the time of World War I, and after, the Germans were defeated, Hitler capitalized on that. And he capitalized on some of the myths that had been created about the Jews in the Middle Ages. And one of them was, Gary, what was the name of that one you talked about, the blood?
The blood
Right,
libel.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and he used that to talk about or to promulgate the idea that the Aryan race was a superior race and that the Jews and all their genetic pool had to be systematically destroyed. So these stereotypes really, burden the Jewish people over time. And it's important, I think, for us to understand, I guess, that, as you said, Rabbi, that this is a prejudice which, unfortunately, goes back to pre-Christian times in Greek and Roman era. Clearly, after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem and then the formation of the Roman Empire, there's no question about the very erroneous and heinous, declaration that the Jews killed Jesus. And that was another burden for the Jewish people. There's no question about it. And it wasn't really until the Catholic Church in the 1960s issued two major statements that even the Anti-Defamation League say were major documents of the 20th century to help reverse this horrible thinking about the Jews. And one was it's called Nostra Aetate, but it was really a document published in 1965 And in that document, the church just, says we have to correct all the bad things we said about the Jewish people. And a second document in 1998 is called the Document of the Remembrance of the Shoah. And this is really where the church recognizes its erroneous and unjust interpretation of that whole New Testament idea about Jesus being killed by the Jews, which he was killed by Roman soldiers. But apologizing and acknowledging the unspeakable tragedy of the Holocaust. That second statement, I think it was John Paul II, who himself had witnessed the Holocaust in Poland. But it wasn't until those two major statements came to sort of remedy that. But there are other stereotypes and myths that the Jewish people have been burdened with.
Right, and I think one document that is continue to reverberate in today's manifestation of hatred is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that was published by the secret police of the Tsarist Russia that really helped all the Russian programs at the end of the 19th century and after the Russian Revolution.
Right. That was another one.
Major Jewish communities in Ukraine and in Russia were actually wiped out, and that really began the more actively and more energized Zionist movement to bring Jews to the ancestral land in Israel.
Because the document was fabricating that all the rabbis wanted to take over the world, right?
Correct.
Right.
And many other fabrication which today actually are being still used. It actually has been used by other radio shows like Kathleen, a Catholic speaker, and also in contemporary times where conspiracy theories are filled with those kind of stories about the Jews and the revival of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Rabbi.
I wanted to share with you a personal story that happened to me that is related to what Hadar was saying. I was serving a synagogue. I was serving the Jewish community in Chile. Chile is a more Catholic country. It's a more traditional country than the United States.
Is this not where Rabbi Skorka? No.
No, he's from Argentina.
Okay.
He's from Argentina.
Right, sorry.
Yeah, no. And so I was invited to go to the southern part of Chile to a small town and talk there to the community. And so I was invited to a church to speak there. I get in the church and someone begins to look at me, to see, my head, and turns around and says, what's going on? He says, but it's the first time I meet a Jew.
Oh.
First time. And you don't have horns.
Yeah,
Exactly.
You do not have a tail.
Yeah.
I mean, that stereotype of being the agents of the devil,
Mhm.
Yeah.
it's happening now. This happened to me 10, 12 years ago, right? So it is something that is so embedded in the culture, so embedded in the conscience of people that it's very hard for them to get rid of this, right? So it all comes from what we were talking about, Jews as deicides, right? We were the people who killed God, who killed Jesus, ritual murderers, agents of the devil, and it's so present even today that those myths, unfortunately, have demonized and dehumanized the Jews over the generations.
Precisely. And I mean, there's one that in doing a little background look for this, I was surprised to find out, I even had mentioned that to Gary, Karl Marx, who was Jewish himself, right? In Das Kapital, he characterizes the Jewish people as saying, quote, money is the jealous god of the Jew before whom no other gods may stand, right? So, which is a perpetuation of that same horrible myth. And so that's something that is important to understand, that in some ways, from the Greek and Roman times, right? So think about it. So the Jewish people in classical Greece or classical Rome do not want to participate in the polytheism, right? Because they have a covenant with their God. And they're the first people to have monotheism, right? And by the way, Christianity has its roots in this history, right? Right? The Jewish Torah is, where our roots are, where we're born. But in any case, so because they have a different belief, they're ghettoized, right? They're they're not allowed any of participation in society, right? And so even from that earliest time, they're thought of as let me be kind and say unusual, because they won't participate in the intermarrying, and they're thought of as.
Let me bring you one step earlier. I think that when we talk about the roots of anti-Semitism, it's not only under the Roman Empire. It's not only
earlier.
It goes all the way back to the Bible. When you see, for example, you probably remember in the book of Numbers, it's Numbers chapter 23. Remember, the Jews were in their way to the Promised Land, and there is this king who's very scared and afraid. The king of Moab, right? His name was Balak, and he says, "How can I defeat the Jews?" And he says, "I'm going to hire this prophet, this magician." His name was Bilam, right? So Bilam is hired in order to curse the Israelites, the Jews. So he goes up to the top of a mountain, and what does he see? He says, "Am levadad ishkon." He says, there is a big nation, he says, that is dwelling in solitude. They're different. They're different. And there's nothing wrong, nothing bad to be different. But unfortunately, for so many people, there is a difficult component to accept someone who thinks different, who believes different, who eats different, who prays different, right? So I think that even if when you go back to the time of the Bible, you can see how this plays out even then.
That's one of the things that we try to educate, I hope, our students about, that difference doesn't mean inferior. Different doesn't mean that you create the other. When we create the other, then we make them the enemy. And so that's an important principle or idea that we're trying to, because we're all different, but how does difference create community rather than animosity, right? Which has always happened to the Jewish people, because they have been, in a sense, like even when they came to America, right? A bunch of Eastern European Jews, maybe 200,000 come, right? 1881 to around 1914. And they immigrate. They have different customs. They have different way of dressing. They have different way of speaking. They have a different way of their mannerisms, the way they're raising their children, etc. And that difference turns all into a discrimination or a degradation or trying to really destroy another people. And that we see over and over again in lots of prejudice. It's the basis of prejudice. It's one of the bases of prejudice. But that's something that the Jewish people have carried. And as I said, even when they came to America, they've had some of that.
Can I just chime in with one
Sure.
other comment about the Nostra Aetate, which is really, that was the game changer in 1965, as you noted, Dr. Loris, when a Pope in Vatican II declared that we got to stop this hatred. Jews are the children of God, and we got to do better, and we recognize the role that we had in all kinds of horrible things throughout history. That was such an important thing, because it really gave people the opportunity to reset and to really have the ability to discover on their own, as you said, the difference. But sometimes the difference can be good, and there was no religious motivation or justification anymore. In fact, it was just wrong. And I have a good friend who's a father, Father Michael Dolan. I went on an ADL trip to Israel with him and other clergy from interfaith clergy from the state. And when we came back, we continued to be close, and he would teach at a seminary in Bloomfield, Connecticut, right next to Hartford, near where I live. And he had a group of young seminarians, about 20, 25 people, and he asked me to come talk to them about Judaism, and about the work that we did together and the commonality that we found in one another. And he warned me. He said, most of the folks in the class are Americans, and they get it. They understand Jews, and they understand Nostra Aetate, they understand. But there are some people from different parts of the world who don't know about it. So it goes to show you that even though such a sea change has occurred, it doesn't mean it gets taught equally well in every part of the world. So that's something he worked on, and that's something that goes to show you that even wonderful change sometimes doesn't take place
It does.
immediately.
Well, I mean, so that brings us really to one of my other questions, which is, because you said in our other conversation, that there was a change certainly in the 20th century, and it's true. People after the Holocaust, I mean, I think they took a deep, remorseful breath and rethought some of this, and so just post-Holocaust maybe changed people's hearts and minds and ways of uh, treating and interacting with Jewish people. But now we're seeing a resurgence. I mean, clearly, if you're reading, the newspaper or looking at TV, or I just reading some things from the ADL, I mean, there's kind of a reemergence of um, anti-Semitism, and what is that from? Where is that coming from?
Yeah.
What are some of the causes of that?
Well, first of all, I would like to suggest or to share with you that this kind of shift that you're depicting, that post World War II, which any human being could not be
Appalled?
affected, appalled,
Horrified?
and convinced that it needs to be different. So and that kind of immediately after the war, anti-Semitism in general, or the views about the Jews in general, start improving. And right now, I'm talking about the United States from
Right.
that perspective, a kind of culminating into the mid '60s, as you say, where the church took this important step to say that the Jews did not kill Christ, and that really start forming the Judeo-Christian perspective and union of
Relationships,
two major religions who are really fusing and fueling interest and interfaith attempt, a collaboration, and so forth and so on. And I think that really facilitated the changes that we've seen of major decline of anti-Semitism into the 70s. I mean, it will be so rare in America to really encounter anti-Semitic, not that people did not own thoughts of that nature, but it has been marginalized. It was not okay to speak that. If you look then what's happening in the world at the time, you'll see a parallel process where after World War II, there was no question that the Jews needed a safe place, and the kind of Zionist movement that started at the end of the 19th century get full speed, and Israel is established in 1948. And quite a bit of people in the world, including Americans, after the Israel is being recognized and so forth, are viewing Israel in a very positive way. It's the underdog. They got out of the ghettos, out of Auschwitz, and they have their country now. And as Israel was becoming more and more established, it's a very young country at the time, becoming still young country, I should say, but becoming much more economically, militarily, culturally influential in the area and very capable of protecting itself. We see in the same time a shift. And the shift is that, as I said before, that anti-Semitism as a classic way of expressing your hatred of the Jew shifts into the anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli rhetoric, saying we are not anti-Semites. We just don't like Israel's policy. And that opened a platform of very engine-fueled effort to actually, which I would like to add to your question about how do you actually define anti-Semitism, where you see the what we call the 3Ds, and not my invention. Is Sharansky came with delegitimization,
Yeah.
demonization, and double standard. That when it comes to Israel, which the way that they addressed the Jews before, there is delegitimizing Jews. You cannot have land. You cannot participate in higher places in the government. We don't trust you. You in the early years you cannot go to universities.
This is in America.
In America, yeah, in America and in Europe. It's not
Yeah.
only in America.
Well, it definitely was happening in America and Europe.
And
Yeah.
Europe. And then it's the demonization. You just gave a great example, Rabbi. Seeing the Jew as the so-called
Scapegoat, devil.
no, devil,
Devil.
born,
God.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
unhuman actually. But now it's about Israel, the demonization of Israel. It's an apartheid state. It's a Nazi. The way that they're treating people, they are abusing human rights. The same. It's a parallel process. And of course, later on, the double standard, where Israel is being treated in the United Nations like no other nation in the world, where it's being fueled into international effort of actually exercising anti-Semitism clogged by some resolutions and human rights violation and all of those things. And I would like to actually alarm us because it's in a very clogged language, in a very way that they were successful in doing in, as you said, after World War One, that Hitler was able to clog that and say, the Jews are coming and taking
Right.
over. Let's get rid of them. And that's what they're doing now in terms of Israel. And if you look into it, if you look what the United Nations, which is that was the one of the most beautiful things that happened after World War II, is like the to have a United Nation. We make sure it will not happen again. And now they are actually directly responsible to this form of anti-Semitism. And I would like to share with you a couple of things that should alarm us. In terms of there are 10 permanent agenda items in the Human Rights Council in the United Nations. So, which are always being addressed. So item number 4, always address all countries in the world, whatever happens in all over the country. Item number 7 is addressing Israel only. While there is no item for Syria, there is no item for Iran and the violation of North Korea with their way that they treat their people. The United Nations Economic and Social Council in 2019 condemned Israel for a violation of women's rights. Israel was condemned because of violation of women's rights, which is, women's rights are quite preserved in Israel. And it was backed by Iran. It was backed by Saudi Arabia because of that, and Pakistan. So the reason why I'm bringing it because it's blatant. It's not like you need to read. It's so.
It's not subtle.
It's not subtle. It's kind of in your face, if you will.
Do you think?
And people are okay with it.
But do you think that? So when we're looking at America, right,
Mm-hmm.
and the Tree of Life Synagogue, or some of the anti-Semitism when we saw in Virginia, for
Yeah.
example,
Uh-huh.
Charlottesville, right? There are a lot of white supremacist groups that are involved in that,
Mm-hmm.
for sure, and I think that may be one of the forces in America that continues or fosters anti-Semitism. But do you think that what you're talking about is influencing the anti-Semitism in America? How do you think America is responding to those things that you're talking about? What do you, Rabbi?
I think that the three Ds that Hadar just brought are crucial to understand the modern anti-Semitism and the modern delegitimization of the state of Israel. When you, for example, you hold the Jews collectively, responsible for actions of the state of Israel, that's anti-Semitism. That's anti-Semitism. And I think that another very important element that is related to Charlottesville, it's related to Poway, it's related to the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, is education. And we are living in a society where a number of young people just are not aware of what's going on with the Jewish people and other minorities in the country. When you see the modern and the current statistics, I'm frightened. I'm frightened. And I can share with you some of the statistics. For example, 2/3 of American millennials don't know about Auschwitz.
Yeah.
2/3.
That one's breathtaking.
22% of American millennials have not heard about the Holocaust. Right? So we have a problem. It's a big, big problem. So I think that education is crucial. Colloquiums like this are crucial.
Exactly.
Talking about interfaith is crucial. And, letting people know that be different is for the benefit of the society. It is for the benefit of the society. So together with the three Ds that Hadar was talking about, I think that education is a powerful antidote against hatred, racism, discrimination, and certainly anti-Semitism.
And that's obviously the purpose of this colloquium, but I mean, on a much broader scale, the percentages that you're talking about, young millennials are students, some of them, who don't know about the Holocaust or who don't know about Auschwitz, or some of the things that they don't know about Black history, for example. And I don't want to run the two, together, but it is a stunning and a startling absence of education for these young people. And so that's something that I think,
There were efforts to help remediate that. For instance, just 2 years ago, our state passed a law, maybe 3 years ago now, passed a law requiring Holocaust education in the schools. There's a similar law that passed the year after for African American education, African American studies. So there are efforts.
And now they're trying to do it for the Asian.
Yes,
yeah.
There are efforts to
this
try
is
to.
good to know.
It
This
really
good
is
to know.
because people are beginning to ignorance causes all kinds of problems in the world, and we see it especially when it comes to hate. There's no question about it. So there are people thinking seriously about how to remedy that. But one of the things that I think is really important too is that we see too many things that aren't right and don't do enough about them. We need to educate our children and ourselves to make sure that we speak up in the face of any kind of hate, any kind of racist or hateful joke. People who say those things think that they can say it comfortably and there'll be no consequences. We need to make sure that people understand that hate does have consequences, and we're going to stand up and correct them and say that is not the way that I want to hear people talking. And I think the more we do that, the more we take ownership of doing the right thing, I think the better off our society will be. But I think, and I've seen that from the work that I've done, that people need to be reminded that they have the right not to be a bystander. They have the right to stand up and do the right thing, and they have the right to express their opinion. When that happens, I think there's a contagious effect for other people to do the right thing too. So education is the key, and we can make it better, but we have to enforce what is right and what is wrong.
Even on our small individual levels.
And Gary knows I'm a big supporter of ADL. I think it's a wonderful organization, and I learned from ADL what you were saying. And I always tell my students that one of our responsibilities today is to not be a bystander, but to be an abstander. Right? It's a transition
That's a good
from
way to put it.
being bystander to abstander. And I think that's a very powerful image, no? And a good way to put what Gary was saying.
We tell our students that as well. And I know, for example, in our CIT seminars, and we talk, well, we'll read something like Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and just other works. But, we'll ask them, so if you're in the residence halls, or you're in the lunch areas and you hear other students making remarks that are discriminatory towards any group, how are you an upstander, if you
Right.
will? How do you take responsibility to do that? And obviously, we as the adults, need to model that for our students. And it's harder for them to think about that. They have this, they don't want to not be accepted, right? They don't want to not be part of the group. But it's something that really is important for, I think, high schools, colleges, universities to help reinforce and strengthen their students, if you will, their young people, to be able to do that kind of thing.
And,
I also, yeah.
And I would add that when you're talking about administrators, they even have bigger roles. Even in university campuses where free speech is a really important thing, as you know. But bad speech can be countered by better speech. You don't always have to say you can't say anything in order to make the point that it is wrong. And one of the things that I think we try to encourage, or we ought to try to encourage, is for administrators to speak up when a bad act happens. For instance, there was a swastika incident at a school in part of Western Connecticut. And one of the things that we always encourage the administrators to do is to make it very clear to the students that this is wrong, this is unacceptable, this is not who we want to be. And with that simple kind of coaching, the students will think, yeah, that was nice. But if there's no one telling them, no one giving them the direction,
Right.
they'll begin to think, well, maybe it's not so bad because no one said anything. So that's the second part of the component.
So I know it seems a little with self-interest, but at Sacred Heart, I'm proud to say that our president is very much like that. And, he's constantly sending out emails to the whole community.
It's not only about anti-Semitism. It's about, discrimination towards any minority or any minority group.
Yeah, he just, for him, it's like, it's non-negotiable, right? There is no hate on this campus, no discrimination, whether it's Black, Asian, LGBTQ, Jewish, it doesn't matter to him. This is, we don't tolerate that. And, so he writes really strong letters about that, emails, if you will, to the whole community. And students who would violate that are sanctioned, right? They meet consequences. There are consequences to it. But we do, I think, on our own campus, a lot. We're not done yet, but we're trying to do a lot of work to promulgate a different culture, a different mindset for our students so that they understand that we're a community of different people and that love has to embrace us all. And really, if one wants to pick the best of the Catholic tradition, then it's love. It's love and acceptance. Right? That's the better part of the Catholic tradition. So if Jesus, as a prophet, or however Christians believe about him, his message was one of love and accepting all people. So I think at Sacred Heart, we Rabbi, you can certainly comment about that. But so in our campus ministry, we have, a Catholic priest, a rabbi, an imam, and an LGBTQ, a lesbian Protestant minister.
Right. So when Hadar was talking about interfaith dialogue, right?
Right, you guys do that all the time.
Which is a wonderful thing that we have here. So tomorrow morning, for example, Father Tony Ziora, our good friend and wonderful friend and big presence here at Sacred Heart, invited an imam, invited me and he, a priest, to talk to his students about interfaith dialogue. Right? So I think that those are ways how to build bridges of understanding, bridges of of education that can really move us forward to counteract anti-Semitism and prejudice and discrimination.
Are there things that you think at a larger level, a larger either community level or state level or government level, that you think need to be addressed that are not being, I know when we were talking on the phone, you were talking about some of the things, the kinds of protections, for example.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that occurred over the last couple of years, largely as a result of the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, is that our elected officials recognize the need to enhance security to try to minimize the likelihood of these kinds of things reoccurring. So I think we should be proud of both our federal and state governments. Both are setting aside funding to help not-for-profit institutions of all kinds, as long as they're vulnerable to threats, to enhance their security, to make going to synagogue or mosque or a church as safe as it should be. So that's a very big step that's being taken, and I think it really shows a lot of understanding and character on the part of our government. The one thing I'll mention that's related, one of the biggest problems in the history of the Jewish people when it comes to anti-Semitism is that there really weren't anyone on our side in most of these countries. Government, police, or law enforcement, they would support the bad actions against good people. That's not true in our country. Our country, the elected officials, the political leadership, law enforcement, does stand to support the people who may be victimized of whatever religion or whatever reason they're being discriminated against or threatened. That's a very, very important thing that we have to keep in mind, even though there are things to be depressed about and there are things to be worried about. In our country, the leadership are standing up and saying and doing the right thing, which at least I think gives support and comfort to the people who may be victimized. And I think that's one of the things that is special. We have a lot of issues in our country we got to do better on.
Right.
But in that respect, I think we have a lot to be proud of.
So do you see? Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I do agree that and of course now we have hate crimes, and there are norms that we agree as a community that cannot be broken, and if you do, you can be jailed and so forth. But there is another place where I find it to be not protected enough, and that's because it's complicated, which is the media and the mass media, and now the internet, and where free speech is a good thing, God knows, and however, hate speech is not a good thing, and conspiracy speech is not a good thing, and what we pride ourselves that we are very free and open and able to do, which is terrific in terms of human rights and freedom of speech and all other rights, it needs even more so monitoring and to have some kind of thresholds that cannot be passed, because if not, we are witnessing, actually, in my opinion, the slaughtering of the thing that we are most found precious, like free speech. Because if you get a speech that is poisonous, it's conspirational, it's flawed, it's false, it's accusatory, it takes very little to move from speech to action. And when it moves to action, it becomes a crime, when it's a hate speech.
And I think,
So,
go ahead.
yeah, no, so I wanted to say that that is an area that may also explain and maybe partially answer what had happened recently. We've been so good in marginalizing this kind of hate speech and hate anti-Semitism.
But it's been wide open in the past 4 or 5 years.
Right.
Right.
And
I mean, the white supremacist groups are.
But yes, absolutely.
Well, they communicate often through the internet and
Yes.
All
social
of us
media.
do.
Right.
All of us do.
Right.
And I want to say, I mean, I think it's, to me, it's very important, and thank you for letting me say that. But yes, there is the extreme right, the alt-right, all of the extreme conservative versions of neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and anti-other, if you're immigrant or wherever. But the extreme left is responsible. There is a major co-option of liberalism in the country in the name of this is, we are going to actually protecting others, and by doing so, blaming the wrong people. And having, doing that, and we see a lot of intersectionality now, of course, where the view of that's back to anti-Israel, that Israel is being viewed as the villain, and that's a way that I see that as a place where it's clogged by the right things. I mean, it's good to protect minorities, but Jews are not minority when it comes to protection.
Say what
Jews are not getting the benefit of being a minority when it's come, because Jews
to be protected.
because there are a lot of Jews are white, and it's being viewed again as a, here is a white, let's say the white male, that would be the common one, they happen to be a Jew, and there is the same kind of wish to shut that process down. They're being viewed as the villain, while you don't benefit from the fact that you're also a minority. So, so I think that is something that needs to be looked at when you ask how can we attend to those things.
Right. What are
I
some
mean,
of the things?
our the students here in Sacred Heart are not going home and thinking about the bubonic plague. They don't thinking about the Crusaders. They think about what they read
On the internet
or in other chat groups,
Right.
and the BDS movement and the apartheid week and all of the things that is happening on campuses. So they know about that, and they don't have a setting to really understand what is that they are actually standing for, or most importantly against, if it's not accurate. So I think that needs to be a little bit
How
more.
would we address that? What are some of your thoughts about that?
I think it's crucial what Hadar is saying. I think we are in need of more supervision and overview of social media, for sure. Not only when we talk about anti-Semitism, right?
Absolutely.
When we talk
Absolutely.
about Islamophobia, or the hate of Asian Americans and other minorities in our countries, certainly that. At the same time, when you were speaking, I was thinking about the other side of social media, right? It has its challenges, but at the same time, there are a lot of benefits for social media today, right?
Of course.
People who repost or post or use social media to educate other people, right? And so I think that's the balance that we need to try to find. As you were saying, how do you counteract a hateful or bad speech with a better speech, right? So here I feel it's similar to that, right? When you see something like that, so you should be posting
Right.
more of, more educational things, more educational elements that can, balance a little bit what we are seeing on social media.
So that is still a big problem that we have to tackle. And I'm not sure really, when you're saying there should be more supervision or oversight, et cetera, how that would happen.
Well, one of the ways that it happens is the effort to get the media giants and the internet giants to police themselves better.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that has been an effort that's been ongoing for a number of years. And there has been some progress in terms of the Facebooks and the Twitters starting to pay more attention to the hate that has, clogged up their airways. But I do think there's a way to go. It's interesting. You remember South Pacific the song about you got to be carefully taught to hate, and that was 1949, whatever it was, and of course it was generally, that hate was taught in the family, generally speaking, and not to say that doesn't happen anymore, but that's old school. Now, because of the internet and because of access to all kinds of information, people are getting their hate fed from people they'll never meet in person. And that's all it takes to trigger somebody to do some heinous thing. So that is something that I do think makes sense, to keep working to hold these media giants responsible for what their platform allows people to do, and to better monitor it, and to recognize that we're not going to permit unbridled hate and calls for violence to be disseminated. Again, I don't want to say there's been no progress, because I think there has, but I do think there's a way to go, and that would be a wonderful benefit and blessing to all of us if that self-policing would be more actively undertaken.
Well, we have a way to go on that.
Yeah.
And I think, currently our country certainly is polarized politically, religiously. How do you think that polarization might play into, or does play into, anti-Semitism or any of the hate crimes? Do you see that?
I think that what we've seen historically, and I think that we see it even in very present times, like in 2008 when the housing crisis occurred and people plunged into a lot of economic hardship, you start seeing rise of really both of anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant view, and the same kind of blaming of the other and scapegoating the other on having a place where you can say that you're the reason why I'm suffering,
Right.
is actually happening in the 21st century now.
It's happening now
Exactly.
in America.
And if it is actually not being corrected, and if, as I said before, there are areas like the media and the social media and and movements that are not being countered, they're not being asked actually to be true to information, then you really see the emboldening this kind of extremism and increase in hate. And Jews always been hated, so anti-Semitism and anti-immigration.
So they're just the most likely
and-
scapegoat to begin with. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we are seeing a lot of that, though. I mean, hate crimes, as I said, the alt-right, the white supremacy groups, the groups like the Proud Boys, etc., that have certainly taken, they have much power, in their groups. And so I think, as Joe Biden, his job is to try to unify the country, and one of his things is going to try to deal with these groups. But the anti-Semitism is, as you pointed out, that's going to be one of the sort of outcomes or outgrowths of, if you will, thinking about a scapegoat. Rabbi, you were going to say something.
I think there is a relationship between polarization and anti-Semitism. I think that when the society is polarized, you see the other as a threat and not as being created in the image and likeness of God like you. And when you see the other person as a threat to your beliefs, to your political view, to who you are, that's when polarization occurs. And I think that has a direct impact with minorities and people who may not look like you, who may not think like you, who may not behave like you. And therefore, I think there is this connection, this deep connection, unfortunately, between polarization and anti-Semitism.
I think that's what Hadar was really moving towards, and you articulate it very well. Did you want to?
Yeah, just very, very briefly, I think the polarization is a key, and the rhetoric is very much a key too, because there is a certain amount of polarization that is almost inevitable, but the rhetoric fires up the fringes in a way that is very, very unhelpful. And so hopefully we can move a little closer, but even if we don't get that close, we can at least recognize that it doesn't benefit any of us if we don't tamp down the rhetoric. The one other statistical thing I'd like to make associated with that, which I think is sort of a little bit of an irony, but I think it's important for folks to understand. We are seeing a rise in acting out of anti-Semitism in the terms of violence, but the truth is, in terms of overall anti-Semitic attitudes, our country is still really relatively low. It's at about 11, and ADL does measure these things, others do too. ADL has it, I think, in the last measuring period of 11%. Now, it's still a lot of people. I mean, that's, tens of millions of people.
11% of our population?
Of the population harbor distinctly anti-Semitic perspectives.
So 11% of the U.S. population.
Of the U.S. population. Now, there are many countries where you get in the 80s.
Right. But we have like 89% that are not.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So, but the problem is, what we're seeing is there is more acting out of a component of that fringe than we've seen act out, at least recently.
In the past 10 years, more in the past 3 or 4 years.
Right. And that's, and not that there haven't been incidents before, because there have been, but there have been more successfully nasty incidents.
And just more.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And one of the things that I think is interesting to note statistically, that the FBI does keep hate crime statistics, and they divide it on all number of bases, race, religion, etc. And when you look at the statistics for hate crimes targeting on the basis of religion, Jews are always in the 60% area. So of all the different religions,
they're the highest number.
Yeah, 60% of the total are attacks on Jews. So even the good historically that we've been discussing and I'm happy to identify, still, when people look to act out against people on a religious basis, it's still Jews.
Jewish people become the first scapegoat. Yeah. Which is what Hadar was really. I think that's what you were saying.
I think that one of the things that I'm trying to also, I know I'm alarmed by it, and maybe kind of share that with those who listen, that I think that there is quite a bit of fueling of anti-Semitism in a way that is not being identified as such, which will show its ugly face not so far into the future. And those are the kind of anti-Semitism which are more contemporary version. As I said before, that the anti-Semitism is more an attack on Zionism and anti-Israel rhetoric.
Or Israel.
And that the reason why it is so important to address it, because it's being sponsored by the media, by universities. For instance, I read the New York Times regularly, and almost regularly I'll see a biased reporting about Israel. You can say, oh, you care about it because you're Israeli. Yes, I do care because of that.
But
you do know I have an accent, I know. I do care about it because I'm an Israeli, but I do care about it because I'm an American. Because that means that there is writing on the wall that is kind of creeping onto the board, and we are not reading it yet. Because if you don't take responsibility for that, you will find a group of people really developing incorrect information that is fueled by hatred, and then the mechanism of the classic anti-Semitism is already set. It's been practiced for thousands of years. We know how to fall into that. So, I'll give you just a recent example because it's been on the newspaper and I'm sure you've seen it, is that Israel has been, as you know, is leading in vaccination. More than 50% of the population is vaccinated, and the media has reported it as being anti-Palestinian. That they are not actually the only vaccinating the Jews, and that is completely false, because they are Arab Israelis, they are Christian Israelis, they are Druze, they're being vaccinated. They're not only vaccinating the Jews, and the Palestinians are being vaccinated by the Palestinian Authority, by the request and by the Oslo Accord and all the, the arrangement. And you can see that in, Saturday Night Live joking about it, in the newspaper, in the front page. So is it alarming when you read it? No. You think, oh, they're only, taking care of the Jews. They're a Jewish state. But it's alarming because it implies they're not doing it for the others. So we are the others, so we should protect ourselves from this evil Israeli tendency, Jewish tendency, or whatever. And that's how it is become the making of, as you said, acting out of anti-Semitism.
So between that and really what you're talking about, even though there are only 11% of the population in America that may harbor anti-Semitic views, there is more acting out. And you're talking, so these are some of the things that, maybe we need to continue to talk about, but certainly we want our audience to keep in mind. There are many positive and good things, and we've made headway, but again, this is an enduring hate, and it seems to continue to morph, if you will, and transform itself in different ways and appear in different ways. And so it's something that through education, through awareness, through consciousness, through acting through our government agencies, etc., that we need to continue to pay attention to. And I like what you said before, Rabbi, that it's not until we recognize, that we're all created by God, the same God, really, and in that image of God, that we are kin or community. We're not the other. That's what you were talking about before. Right. But it would take a long time to make that kind of transformation. I'm not giving up on it, but I think having this conversation with you tonight has been just wonderful, and I really appreciate the time you've taken, and I'll probably call on you to do it again. So be ready for that. But thank you very much.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Dr.
thank you. Thank
Really
you, Dr.
appreciate it.
Loris.
Good night to our audience. Thank you for being with us this evening. And stay tuned for more Heart Challenges Hate. We'll see you again.
Thank you for joining today's conversation. To learn more, visit sacredheart.edu.